Welcome, everybody. We are back on the Swilletariat with our guest for the third time, I believe, Chris Cutrone, aka the last Marxist. Chris, welcome back.
Hello, how's it going, Eamon?
It's going pretty good, except for the disaster of the internet and computer I just had to deal with. But yeah, and it's freezing out here in Canada. And
Bitter cold, yeah, in Chicago too. Yep.
okay, oh, now my phone is playing the video. That's all right. So you just wrote a very spicy article. That's why we're here today. Well, at
Hmm.
least in some circles, it's considered spicy. The
Right.
article, you entitled it "Why Greenland," and I believe Compact Magazine, which asked you for the article, titled it "The Future Belongs to America, So Should Greenland."
Right.
And in the article, I'm Canadian, and you mentioned
Hmm.
Canada here, and this was all a response to what Trump had been saying about joking about annexing Canada, or at least making Canada the 51st state, and that Justin Trudeau is the governor of Canada. Um, in addition to talking about taking Greenland, taking back Panama Canal, and other things like this. So there's this great
Yes.
fear about Trump's kind of imperialism.
Right.
And
Right.
you've talked about this a few times already on various channels and podcasts, but I wanted to focus on the Canada part as a
Yes.
Canadian.
Absolutely. Right.
Good. So in your article, you mentioned that Canada is counter-revolutionary, and that would kind of as opposed to America,
Right.
which is the revolutionary state. But I am a good millennial Canadian, and I learned in school that Canada is a multicultural, liberal, progressive, peacekeeping nation, Chris. And we're
Yes. All of
polite.
that is kind of revolutionary.
We're polite. We have public health care. We protect women's rights. We're not
Uh-huh.
racist or imperialist or fundamentalist zealots like the United States. We
Hmm.
set the White House on fire and sent you packing with when you started a war with us in 1812, and
Proudly.
and and you've invaded or intervened in over 70 countries. And Canada is a kind, respectful nation, Chris. We want to keep it that way. So why should we want to join the American Revolution, given all that?
Great. So the splash screen that you had for this session that we're doing, reversed the Canadian and American flags over the territories.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was good. Meaning, make America Canada, make Canada the United States. Um, the Fox News right wing, not exactly pro Trump, but pretty much pro Trump, they were saying, no, we don't want Canada. We don't want their national healthcare system. We don't want any of that progressive stuff. So they were thinking, oh, a 51st state, but it's going to be another woke state. It's going to be another California. We don't need that,
Well, if
right?
Justin Trudeau was
Um,
in charge, but not anymore.
well, but generally, right? Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
not like the conservatives are going to reverse that stuff. So, I mean, I'm sure that whatever you guys are going to have some overblown election rhetoric, about how the conservatives are fascists or whatever, like the left.
Mm-hmm.
They usually do this. But I thought that was worth remarking on that, a merger of the United States and Canada would affect the United States. In other words, it wouldn't just turn the Canada into the United States, it would also turn the United States into Canada. And so,
In what way would
meaning,
it turn the United States into Canada?
well, for instance, if it had to take on the national healthcare system of Canada.
See, I would sign up for that. If Canada, if the deal was we got to be part of the states, we get the American dollar, but we get to keep our health care and maybe abortion rights, then win-win.
Well, the states now determine abortion access,
That's right. So there's no real threat.
right? So there is no threat, right? So on that front, now in terms of the national healthcare system, I'll just point out that Trump has repeatedly said, and he still says, around the inauguration, he mentioned what a scandal it is that American healthcare is so expensive and so bad in comparison to other OECD nations. So he always does point out, look, the Europeans, by implication, the Canadians, provide better health care for their people at a lower price, at a lower cost. And that's the issue for him. It's a bottom line issue.
Mm.
And so I always like to point out, for instance, why does Western Europe have the welfare state that it does? Because it's a post World War II phenomenon. Well, because they were under austerity having to rebuild after World War II. And so nationalization and provision of welfare state benefits, it's an austerity measure, meaning it's because capitalism isn't able to do it. And
Mm.
the issue in the United States is complicated because one of the reasons why American healthcare is so expensive is because the American market absorbs the costs of research and development
Hmm.
for medical technology and for big pharma. And that's one of the competitive industries of the United States in the global market. So, that's also part of it, right? So it's not just about the insurance companies, like Luigi Mangione killing the CEO of United Healthcare. And it's terrible that we don't even know the guy's name. He's just a faceless healthcare CEO. Um, well, it's not just the insurance companies that are the problem.
Hmm.
It's obviously the pharmaceutical companies and just the medical industry in general,
Right, but
which,
if had, let's say, FDR or LBJ managed, or even Hillary Clinton managed to bring in a single payer system, you wouldn't, you'd still see the insurance companies. They'd be doing different things, and you'd still see a fairly big medical industry. Like, it's
medical
not like they'd
industry.
be, yeah.
No, there is in Canada too, and in Europe as well. But again, the US is particularly competitive in that field, and there are a lot of joint companies, European, American companies. There's a lot of cooperation there.
Hmm.
And the United States market does absorb some of the costs, right? And so that's part of the deal, right? So, it's not just about cutting the middleman out of private insurance and they're the blood suckers. It's the whole thing, and it is a global industry, healthcare. So, there was an issue, if you recall, about India producing generic versions of drugs a
I don't
few
recall.
years ago. You don't recall? Yeah. So the US was going to try to, and Europe was going to try to punish India for selling drugs for too cheap. Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. This is a real issue. So, this is part of global capitalism. This isn't just some gratuitous profiteering. It's part
So,
of the information economy. It's part of the service economy.
right.
The neoliberal era, right? So anyway, but the bottom line is that in fact, I've pointed out throughout the Trump era, which is now 9 years, that actually the United States is much more likely to get nationalized healthcare from Trump than from the Democrats.
Yeah, could you expand
Much
on
more.
that? Why would that be? Because you most people would think, no, of course it would be a Bernie crat, or even Biden if he was pushed left to for that kind of thing to happen.
Because it would mean making choices about which sector of American capitalism one is going to prioritize. And so, in fact, the Democrats have more, or just as much, I would say, but I would say also perhaps more connections to the medical industry than the Republicans do in terms of who they represent. And of course, these things are in flux now, meaning which capitalists support which party, can shift. And there is something of a shift going on now. But it's a bottom line issue. In other words, if the state looks out for the interests of capital in general rather than particular capitalists and particular corporations, then decisions are made to prioritize some industries over others. That happens. That is the political world of capitalism. And Trump might just decide, look, this is an overhead that we'd rather do without the over expensive healthcare.
Would that not
So,
strengthen the position of the workers in the United States?
I mean, this is the argument of the Bernie crat type people, right?
Hmm.
I don't think so.
Really?
Um, no, I don't, because you know, it's a the idea that people are trapped in their jobs because of healthcare benefits.
But that's true
I'm
in
not sure.
Canada too.
Right, right. So it's just like I'm not sure that that would, change. Meaning what? It's preventing people from striking out as entrepreneurs and starting their own business. It's preventing people from engaging in the gig economy. Like, come on, what are we even talking about? You know?
I mean,
So,
people like in my circle will choose jobs or consider not leaving jobs because they have like a Cadillac style, health benefits
health
plan, which
insurance.
includes,
Yeah.
massage and chiro and all that stuff. And then there's like different tiers, and you might not want to leave your job because you have the good one.
Sure. I mean, I would also say that, private health insurance never goes away for rich people, meaning if you have a national healthcare system, there's still better medicine available to rich people. And rich people doesn't mean the 1%. It means the top 20%,
Right.
right? It means a different, so yeah, the working class is vulnerable. I would say that we should just take it as a given that the working class is vulnerable. So what are we talking about? Are we talking about the middle class? Because that's really the issue. When the Democrats have offered this, they've basically said, you know, we'll give like, Obamacare, like we'll give like, we have um, health savings accounts and they're a tax break, right? So it only kind of makes sense if you have a certain level of income.
Mm.
That and there already is in some ways socialized medicine in the United States, meaning they already absorb, like there's a way that rich people pay more and poor people pay less. And so when they talk about medical bankruptcies and this kind of thing, we're not talking about your wage laborer, we're talking about your middle class person. Those are the ones who get saddled, and face this kind of bleak stuff. And we're also talking about, look, the millennials. We are talking about back in the day when it was like you can stay on your parents' insurance,
Right.
like
Yep.
Obamacare, right? And then it's like, but what happens when that ends? And they were like waiting. So it's like by the time we turn 26,
Yep.
there better be nationalized healthcare. And it's like, come on, So again, this is a moment. I mean, I'm not discounting the possibility of progressive reforms in capitalism, quote unquote progressive, but progressive liberal reforms. But the moment has kind of passed, meaning the Democrats didn't bring it over the finish line. And there are many reasons for that. But we could just say they failed. And what did they fail to do? They failed to convince the capitalist class that this is a good deal,
Mm.
right? That it's a
Otherwise, they
bottom
would have taken it up. Yeah.
right? And I think, again, who's more likely to do that? Trump,
Yeah. Fair.
right? So, I mean, look, conservative governments implemented the welfare state in Western Europe after World War II.
Right. Yeah. 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 Churchill's. Sorry, not Churchill's government. No. Was Churchill reelected eventually after? Yeah, he was.
Eventually, but no, so the Labor brought it in there, but the Christian Democrats did it in Germany, and de Gaulle did it in France.
Right. But the
These are the
conservatives
right.
did also continue it in
Oh, of course, in the
Britain.
UK,
Yeah.
absolutely, of course.
Yeah.
Now, the neoliberal era has been, peculiar in this respect because, again, it's bound up with the service economy and the information economy. And so, there are reasons why there would be moves to privatize. Again, there are international dimensions to it. So, again, but there's a lot of naivete about this. So you could say, okay, well, if there's a kind of, bottom line public benefit, then it does make workers less vulnerable in general, in aggregate, and therefore puts them in a stronger bargaining position with the capitalists. But that's assuming that there is a bargaining position, meaning, the unionization rate is awful in the United States.
Mm, yeah.
And so, in public sector, you know, they're the ones that are more unionized. So it's not, yeah, I think that in terms of like New Dealism or Great Societyism, the big, progressive eras in American history, I think that again, the hope was that there would be something like that in the new millennium, that there's this progressive moment that I think the window is closed on now, meaning Biden is as good as was possible. So anyway, raises the question that Trump is meeting the issue in terms of international trade and in terms of reconfiguring international trade. So I think this is also something that I've pointed out in my writings, which is that this moment, post 2008 crisis and post COVID, inevitably international trade was going to be reconfigured. So,
Mm.
what form that takes, I mean, of course, people have their kind of crotchets. They have their like multipolarity, or maybe it's going to be continentalism or whatever, right? And then they have these, frameworks that they try to fit Trump into as if he's following any such logic. No, it's, he put in the USMCA agreement with Canada and Mexico the ability to renegotiate. And so, of course, now that 4 years have passed and the COVID crisis happened, of course, he's going to take the opportunity in a second term to renegotiate the terms with Canada and Mexico. And that's what he was saying to Justin Trudeau,
Mm.
right? He was saying, still this trade deficit, we're subsidizing you. And, ought you not then just become a 51st state? Because, of course, there are states that are subsidized in the United States. This is part of the discourse after the election. The Democrats are talking about how the red states are
Yeah.
subsidized by the blue states, right? So, but anyway, that none of this was really my concern in this article. My concern in this article was political frontiers. What do these boundaries mean? If there's any sense of redrawing the map, what is it about? And also, look, why does Canada exist?
Why does Canada exist, Chris?
Because the British fended off the United States from taking it. And that's the Revolutionary War, and it's 1812. And, the British wanted to intervene in the Civil War too.
On
And they
the
ran
Confederate side.
on the Confederate side. That's right. Counter-revolutionary side. And they ran the assassination of Lincoln out of Montreal.
Right.
I
So
hope you
so
know that.
so from our perspective in Canada, we kind of we shunt that responsibility off on Quebecers. We say, "Oh, Quebec was the bad guys. They were supporting the Confederates," and we kind of wipe our hands clean of.
Or they were like Bourbon or something.
Yeah.
No, 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 no. I mean, the Quebecois, no. I mean, it's no. I mean, look, it does go back in some ways. Of course, it goes back to the what in the United States is called the French and Indian War, but it's really the 7 Years' War. So it's the war that sort of set up the American Revolution. It's the war that the colonists were meant to pay for with the new taxation that they rebelled against. Right. So that was the British conquest of Quebec. Right. So that's, there's a deeper history there. It's the contest between the French and the British in the 18th century.
Mm-hmm.
And then that, of course, is in the background of the War of 1812 as well, because it has to do with the Napoleonic Wars. And, part of what brought Thomas Jefferson to the presidency was his opposition to John Adams taking the British side against the French in the Revolutionary era. Right. So that's, so again, and Canada fits into this history, therefore, in a kind of, I would say, clear way. It's a British colony.
So you're saying we're
It's
the
the British
baddies.
colony that, yeah, of course, the Tories, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, King Charles is your head of state.
Right.
You have
So
not overthrown the British.
and
So
okay,
it's
and so
time to
why
join the American Revolution.
so it would it if Canada is counter-revolutionary, what would it mean for America, for Canada to become the 51st state? In what way would that be progress historically?
Well, it may not be. That's the thing. So, I mean, of course, I was kind of reporting, if you will. I was just saying what Trump is saying. And, where does this come from historically? And, what is the objective set of conditions that informs political policy So if, I mean, look, there's another way of coming at it, which, why does Canada exist? Again, there's the economics, there's the politics. And the politics, I mean, look, in terms of imperialism, Canada is a junior partner of American imperialism, meaning they sometimes do the dirty work for the United
Chris, what do you
States,
mean? We're the
actually.
peacekeeping nation. Everybody knows that.
You mean like UN peacekeeping
That's right.
forces?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's imperialism too, my man. I mean, meaning I'm a Marxist. I will, pull out my red star if I have to. The United Nations is a den of thieves and their victims. It is an imperialist cartel for keeping the people down. It
Wow.
absolutely is.
So you're
You know,
saying all the peacekeeping missions we went on had some other imperialist interest? Uh,
oh, absolutely. Of course.
mhm.
Yeah, that's their purpose. And, you know, I mean, also there's the other dimension that I should not fail to mention, which is, Canada is like a money laundering operation in large measure too, in terms of how it fits into the world financial system. It does, right? It's a place where a lot of tin pot dictators park their funds. It's a place where a lot of the drug cartels park their funds.
Canada.
Yeah, this has all been out since the Panama Papers. Hello. Like it's not
More
just
so than
Bahamas.
than the I don't know than the tax haven countries in the
Well,
Caribbean.
it's all connected though.
Oh,
Like in other words, one of the things that Canada does is that it serves as a buffer between the United States and the Caribbean,
mm-hmm.
not geographically, but geopolitically, economically, right? That's part of its function in terms of the Commonwealth system. And again, if you look at, for instance, I mean, that's where Canada does have clear, kind of capital exporting characteristics. Like, Canadian companies operate the in the West Indies
Mining.
and in Latin America, right? And so, it's just part of the US led world capitalist system. And it's intimately connected with the United States. It's not like some kind of competitor to the United States. It's not. It's a junior partner, much more so even than Britain.
A junior partner
It's
than to Britain, yeah.
yeah,
Well, Britain
and
has
well,
had their own colonies and they still have their own interests around the world. But
they still have
Canada,
their own interests, right? So this is the thing, so when we think about, okay, what is the purpose of this political frontier? Again, I think that there's this notion that national independence is just an unvarnished good. It's not. It also serves. It serves as a kind of pressure valve, a deflection. They run interference this way. It's like the United Nations. Since one of the things that Trump accomplished was getting the ceasefire to happen in Gaza. I always like to point out, well, if the US voted against Israel in the United Nations, then one of these other countries would, vote for Israel, meaning there's a good cop, bad cop dynamic. If the US voted against Israel, then lo and behold, France or England, the UK, would vote for Israel. They'd veto a Security Council resolution. In other words, what allows them to condemn Israel through these symbolic votes is that they know the US is going to veto it.
I could
If the
see
US
that
suddenly
today,
stopped,
but like, would that necessarily have been
it
true
covers.
25, 30 years ago, 40 years ago? I
Well, the
feel like
French were
if the
much
U.S.
more
had a,
involved
sorry,
supporting Israel. The French were much more involved supporting Israel, like through arms sales, than the United States was before the 1980s.
okay, but if America voted against Israel and France voted to protect Israel and against the resolutions, at the end of the day, America's the only country that matters, though. In
No,
all
the
this.
veto votes are there, meaning the five veto powers are there. The allies in World War II are there: China, Russia, Britain, France, United States. Germany and Japan don't have veto votes. Of course not. They still need to be kept down.
Can't trust Germany or Japan.
No, not really. No. Well, the thing is, no. I mean, look, China would never allow Japan to have a veto.
Hmm.
power in the Security Council. No way. Or to be a permanent member of the Security Council. China would never allow that. And I think Russia would have a problem with Germany having that, right? I mean, whether for good or bad reasons. But, we have to just look at the international order. It's a game. It's a political game. There's a lot of posturing. There's a lot of division of labor. And part of how Canada functions as an independent state is that it's a hand in glove division of labor with the United States. It facilitates US imperialism. It's not some kind of resistance or obstacle to US imperialism, not at all.
So in what way would annexing Canada or be? How could that change the possibility of for socialists organizing?
I mean, look, obviously, any real socialist organizing has to happen across the border, no matter what. Right? I don't know if it's made better or worse by, the 51st state annexation. I mean, I guess it would, if you just eliminated that political frontier, or as Trump put it, get rid of the artificial border. And, I think, a serious struggle for socialism in North America would have to include Canada, the United States, and Mexico, of course. So Trump did not say, let's make Mexico the 51st state. If he did, I would support it. Right? Instead, it was Canada. And, Canada's easier to absorb than Mexico. Canada's got a lower population. And, there are just less obstacles. Canada's part of NATO. Mexico is not. They've floated this Anglophone union, which must not make the Quebecois happy. Right? Because it's not, like, what the hell would that be? My old comrades in the Spartacus League used to say, if Quebec ever got independence, the rest of Canada would just merge with the United States. And that's probably true. Meaning part of why Canada exists is because of the union of French and British Canada. Like that is, the form the political order takes. And, whether it's been advantageous or disadvantageous. Obviously, the United States does a great deal of business with Quebec. So I'm from New York. And so they get a lot of electricity from Quebec hydroelectric. And it's
syrup.
funny. So, right? Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. I've got my maple syrup, of course. Good stuff. But no maple leaf imperialism. No maple leaf imperialism, just to use some more Spartacist rhetoric. Right? But, again, it just is a given for me that socialism means a political union of the United States with Canada and Mexico. No doubt. Now, so where is that a problem? So if there's a socialist revolution in the United States, guess where all the counter-revolutionaries are going to hang out? Canada. Where are they going to operate their counter-revolutionary activity? Canada. So we'll have to eliminate that threat. Maybe Mexico. Perhaps.
It's warmer there. Like, you wouldn't want to hang out in Canada for your plotting.
Of course you would. Look, there's an indefensible border between the United States and Canada. And Canada, is this beachhead of Europe. Not so much Mexico. Mexico's not going to go for it.
Mm-hmm.
Canada's going to go for it. Meaning, if there's a socialist revolution in the United States, Europe is going to reveal itself to be what it is, counter-revolutionary. Of course. See, people have got it twisted.
Would you say the same for China?
Yes. Right? Now, China, that's a harder question because it functions somewhat differently. Meaning, the issue there is that China is going to have to guard itself against the socialist movement in the United States, inspiring people in China. So any socialist movement in the United States, insofar as it inspires people, that will be a threat to the Chinese Communist Party. Now, that's different than the kind of threat that it would represent in Canada or Europe, I think that Canada and Europe, they understand you can co-opt socialists. They've got the social democratic racket going pretty well,
Right?
right?
Yep.
The United States, not so much, right? So again, looking at the possibilities, looking at the possibilities, there is an opportunity in the United States for world socialism. So that's the other thing to keep in mind. And I'd be remiss to not mention the rights we have that Canadians do not have,
We don't
at
have
least
freedom
on
of
paper.
speech.
I mean, it's not as bad as Europe, continental Europe, but it's bad enough.
Hmm.
And, Trudeau, of course, and I know that, the truckers are fascists or whatever, but, it was pretty remarkable how the Canadian government dealt with them, freezing bank accounts and this kind of thing.
Right.
It would
Right.
be harder in the United States.
And declare, I
There's a
think
Fourth Amendment.
Trudeau declared state of emergency, I believe, which had been done before in during was it 68 or the FLQ crisis in Quebec, and they rolled in the tanks with
Yes.
those terrorists, because they had I think they had kidnapped some MPPs and even killed at least one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
60s or 70s? 60s.
I
Late
think so.
60s, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah,
No.
you're right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One or the other.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it was a bit of a surprise for Trudeau to have done that. He didn't do much with the Emergency Act, to be fair, but
No, he had to be careful about it, right? But it was still remarkable.
yeah.
I mean, and again, it's a political game, right? So we have to be aware of politics and the gamesmanship there, and understand the players in the game and the roles that they play. And again, the thing with the United States and Canada, there's far less connections, we might say, between the parties across the border than we might expect.
Hmm.
So that also points to different histories. And there was, for instance, when the one party regime in Mexico cracked up and a new party emerged, PAN, they had some significant connections to the Republican Party in the United States.
Hmm.
But they've been eclipsed now. And so it's, things are a lot more independent politically regarding the parties in Mexico and Canada than in the United States. There are some, I mean, obviously there are connections between the Labour Party and the Democratic Party in the US, between the UK Labour Party. But Canada, I mean, you have a Quebecois party, you have the NDP, so it's a little bit of a different terrain. And it's not that I want to, I mean, so I'll just say Jonathan Chait in the Atlantic writing, his criticism of my article. He said, well, Chris Cutrone thinks that Canada only deserves geopolitical annihilation. And I was like, well, if you put it that way, that sounds pretty good. Geopolitical annihilation, meaning what are we even talking about? But really, the issue is political annihilation.
Hmm.
And, so that's where the 51st state business becomes more complex. So it's a different proposition. But if we're talking about, the struggle for socialism, then we should just recognize that, of course, there are labor unions that operate across the border between the countries, right? In the auto industry, for
Hmm.
example. So, it's just a obvious necessity. And, I mean, I understand that people don't like Trump, but the United States is not Trump,
Right. What is the
and
United States, and
what
why would
is the United
what is
States?
the United States, and why would Canada want to consider joining it?
Well, it depends on what we mean by Canada, right? So there are two things, right? So there's the country as defined by the capitalist class,
Right.
and there's the country as defined by the working class, right? So there's the capitalist racket called the United States. There's the capitalist racket called Canada. But that's not what we're talking about, right? We are talking about how the Canadian racket and the capitalist racket have a modus vivendi with a political frontier. And again, that political frontier serves their interests. And the interests of the working class in the struggle for socialism would conflict with the interests of the capitalists in terms of how that border serves their purposes. Right. So, like I said, if Trump said, let's make Mexico the 51st state, I would be like, hell yes. Right. But obviously, that border serves the interests of the capitalists on both sides of it
Mm.
in a particular way. Namely, it serves to exploit the workers on both sides of the border. It's a joint venture. That border is a way of doing business between the Mexican and American capitalists for the exploitation of the workers in Mexico and the United States.
Do you think maybe
And
Trump
that's
doesn't
also true
understand
of
that
Canada.
that way of doing business?
Well, he certainly does. No, he certainly does, right? But again, he wants to renegotiate the terms. In other words, he's not proposing anything also, all that drastic. So we have to be careful about this. And I think that it's funny how the left gets its national pride hurt. And it's like, what do you have pride in? You have pride in the capitalist racket? Is that what you have pride in? So like on the Greenland front, so you have pride on behalf of the Danish capitalists,
Uh-huh.
right? That's your anti-imperialism. So we have to be careful, about this, meaning that, again, of course, socialists oppose imperialism, and that's a international political system, if we understand it that way, like looking at it just in those terms. The socialists would oppose it for different reasons than the petty bourgeoisie would. And the other thing that I'd like to say about Canada is that it might be a petty bourgeois racket too. It might be a big capitalist racket. It might be a petty bourgeois racket too. And we certainly shouldn't be sentimental about that.
In what way would it be a petty bourgeois racket?
Well, there are a couple of ways you could look at it. It's a small capitalist racket, but it's also a managerial racket,
Hmm.
right? And neither of those should elicit any sympathy from socialists. Meaning like, okay, the Canadians have this progressive way of doing business that they've got down, and the workers have an interest in that, in maintaining that, insofar as it's different from the way the United States does business.
Well, speaking of that, the left. I want to talk about how the left responded to, at least in Canada, to Trump's, um,
Proposal
yeah, Trump's
or
proposals. And
his tweak. Yeah.
yeah, my old comrades in the Revolutionary Communist Party, formerly the IMT,
Oh boy.
Trotskyist
Mm-hmm,
party
mm-hmm,
now.
mm-hmm.
They wrote an article called "What is Behind Trump's Threat to Annex Canada," and their conclusion was
Threat.
that Trump's stated plan of annexing Canada is reactionary. And I'll just go over some of their key points that they bring
Yeah.
up, and
Okay.
I'll let you respond. So
Okay.
yeah, their theory for why this is all happening is it starts with world capitalism is of course sinking deeper into crisis. They always say that.
Mm-hmm.
Post 1991, New World Order is crumbling. So the U.S. empire is in decline, losing
Mm-hmm.
economic ground to BRICS and Turkey. And so a split has emerged in the American ruling class over U.S. imperialism. The established Democrats fighting to remain the world police, and the MAGA wing calling for retreat to manage to manage the Americas. And so to defend America's dominance, Trump is going mask off, pulling away from entanglements abroad while beefing up dominance over America's proximal interests. So kind of going back to the American.
Retrenchment.
Yes, exactly. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and Trump proposes high tariffs for for Canadian exports as one of his measures. But many Canadian industries would not survive a trade war with the United States, which would lead to a
Mm-hmm.
collapse of the Canadian economy, and thus paving the
Mm-hmm.
way for a piecemeal annexation of the provinces potentially. And so this is why I guess this is all reactionary. So I'll let you respond to that.
Well, okay, so does the U.S. need to do this? What Trump is proposing regarding Canada? No, right? It's an option. I do think it's a negotiation ploy with regard to renegotiating the USMCA treaty, trade agreement. Um, I think that he then sort of specified it further as like a EU style free trade zone
Mm.
between the United States and Canada. And again, so what would we be talking about? We'd be talking about protecting Canadian capitalist firms against takeover in a larger market, right? So, I mean, my dear Trotskyists, they are fine, but their assumptions, their premises are all wrong. And likely it has to do with the fear that, I don't know, the conservatives would give it more of a hearing than Trudeau in Canada
Mm.
or something, right? I don't know. Like, it seems to me that it's geared towards, you know, sentiments on the part of, like, I don't know, students and probably, the exhaustion of the liberals scares people. I was reading a comment somewhere about how the conservatives are going to get rid of the national healthcare system. No, right? No. But this is the imagination. Now, again, it will be for mutual benefit, but it would also mean, if it were to happen, it would mean sacrificing some interests in terms of the greater interests. And what are the greater interests? Like the bigger capital, bigger capital cannibalizing smaller capital.
Hmm.
And that's not to be understood in national terms. Meaning, if it's good for a big Canadian capital, then they would be interested in it, and then they'd have to deal with the resistance of small capital, and they'd have to, it would have to happen through a political process. It's not going to happen militarily. I mean, again, Trump, ironically, as I point out, took that option off the table,
You did.
but strangely kept it on the table with Greenland, which seems bizarre because the U.S. already has military bases there. With the Panama Canal, it's got a different significance to leave the military options on the table there. And I'm not saying that I endorse any of this, like, just to be clear, but the question is, what is going on? And I'm not going to get into spurious analysis of like the world historical moment and the global economy and the direction of US imperialism. It's all very controversial in the United States, meaning the Democrats do not approve of what Trump is proposing,
Hmm.
on the one hand. On the other hand, they did confirm Marco Rubio as Secretary of State 99-0, right? And yet, of course, he also, I watched his swearing in ceremony with JD Vance. He swore to, it's in the normal oath of office, like he has to follow Trump. He has to follow the Trump policy. He
Hmm.
does, right? He's signing up for that. And so maybe the Democrats imagine that he'll be some kind of resistance to Trump, but no. And of course, Rubio has his sights set on Venezuela and Cuba,
Yes.
right? And so that would seem to confirm our dear Trotskyist perspective that the U.S. is turning away from the greater world and turning attention towards its own backyard.
Hmm.
But the Democrats support this. They're just as hostile to Maduro and to the Cuban Communist Party. I almost said the Canadian Communist Party. The Cuban Communist Party. What I love is, by the way, Justin Trudeau is the love child of Fidel Castro. You know that one.
Oh yeah. I mean, but if you look at the
That's
pictures, it's
that's
like
that's
it's
amazing. No, it's amazing. It's beautiful. I mean, it's just great. I mean, it's absurd, but it's just it's
there's
and
some
it reminds.
plausibility to it. That's the best part.
There is some, exactly, like all conspiracy theory like stuff. There's like some like tenuous plausibility to it. And was it Ted Cruz who was born in Canada?
Yeah.
Right. And Ted Cruz's father killed JFK, according to Trump. Remember that? In the
Yes, I do
primaries
remember
in
that.
2016.
Who was Ted Cruz's father?
Some Cuban,
No.
right? So this Cuba Canada connection
Mm.
is there, right? So Marco Rubio, I don't know. Does he represent a threat to Canada as a gusano?
Maybe.
Right? Maybe. because I think that, Canadians can vacation in Cuba, right? No problem.
Yeah, we can. But yeah, lately though, over the last year or two, Cuba's been hit pretty hard. So vacationing there isn't even all that fun anymore. They don't. They barely have food.
Is that right?
Yeah,
Under Biden.
under Biden. That's right.
Under Biden. No, and just to be clear, of course, the US embargo against Cuba is criminal,
Yeah, yeah. It's ridiculous.
right? So, but again, one has to deal with it at a political level. And at a political level, the US has a brief against Cuba for supporting terrorism, etc. I mean, Cuba has a brief against the United States for supporting terrorism against it too.
Hmm.
However, what are we even talking about? Like, where it's in that legal universe, who's going to win that fight? Of course, the United States. So, and the Castro family has squirreled billions out of Cuba too. And they have their international bank account golden parachute as well.
Do you think the popular notion on the left that the American empire is declining and that bricks and are kind of rising in its place has any holds any water? Because
No.
it seems like they're almost gleeful about this perspective, this prospect.
Yeah, no, I don't think that there is this new multipolar world order. I don't think so. No, I think that that's not to say that there aren't some challenges facing the world political system of capitalism, in which, of course, China and Russia and Iran participate a great deal. So the US has, again, an embargo against Cuba that's not observed by other countries. The US also has sanctions against Iran that's not entirely observed by other countries either. And, Russia is just a capitalist country. I don't think there's any dispute about that. China is the big question. It's the big question. Whether China is going to become the global capitalist country, which somehow means also leading global capitalism to socialism for the people who are enthusiastic about this. Now, of course, there are the people who are trepidatious about it. So another thing that I think is unfortunate is foreign policy wise, it could be seen as the Democrats are prioritizing conflict with Russia, and Trump and the Republicans are going to prioritize conflict with China.
Right. That's how it's. That's how it's.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think, look, Trump invited Xi to the inauguration. He sent the Chinese vice president instead,
Hmm.
right? So that's, in other words, there's an overture that's being made by the United States. I don't think that Trump wants war with China, and you know he doesn't want war with Russia, but that's for different reasons, we might say,
Hmm.
or it's for the same reason, meaning probably Trump doesn't want war, period. And I know that also is cognitive dissonance on the left
Well,
because they'll
if he
say,
didn't want
"Oh,
war, why did he provoke Iran?
he did not. He retaliated. He retaliated against Iran, and he just stripped John Bolton of his security clearances.
Hmm. Saw that.
Um,
Love that.
and John Bolton wanted a full scale attack on Iran, and Trump was like, "No, we'll just kill one guy."
So that was the compromise move. That was the
Of
invite.
course, it was the pacifist move, meaning like you get one guy who's actual leader of terrorist operations who has blood on his hands, and and anyone in his car, these are guilty people. No issue of innocent civilians being killed, no collateral damage, just boom. And not in Iran, outside of Iran, in Iraq, where that's where the attacks against American soldiers had happened, in Iraq. And so it was like, okay, if you're going to attack US soldiers, then we'll kill your guy when he comes to Iraq. I mean, I'm not saying this is a good thing. What I'm saying is we have to understand that he had a menu of choices, and he chose the crazy option that he wasn't supposed to choose.
Mm.
So the more rational option was some kind of series of airstrikes against Iran. In the foreign policy establishment view, that would have been the more rational course of action. And Trump was like, no, I don't want to start a war with Iran.
Mm.
They're just like, oh, he's dangerously unpredictable. Do you know that Elon Musk, since Elon Musk is all on the news, Trump sent him to meet with the Iranian delegation at the United Nations soon after the election in
That
order to tell them we want to reopen negotiations with Iran.
well, why did then why was he so why did he kill the Obama deal in his first term then?
Oh, because he didn't like the terms. So he wants a different deal.
I mean, it
And
seems like
he,
a pretty risky maneuver if he wanted to stay, if he wanted to a keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and b to keep them on good terms.
it's not about good terms. And it's not, it's also the Obama deal was not really preventing them from advancing in terms of their nuclear program. And, you know, again, he doesn't like the terms, but he does want a deal. So it's not about deal, no deal. It's not about war versus negotiation. It is not. And in fact, bad negotiation, which is what Trump thinks the Democrats do, might be a more likely path to war than saber rattling that gets you to the negotiating table. Meaning, if you think you're playing nice, that could lead to war. Whereas if you saber rattle, that could keep the peace. And again, he just thinks they're bad negotiators. And it seems to be right about that. They haven't been doing a good job. You know, meaning this whole Gaza war happened under the Democrats. Where's their deal making, negotiating capacities demonstrated there, right? So when he says this would never have happened under his watch, what he's saying is they would have been afraid of me, but also I would have dealt with them better, right? That's the idea. So again, we have to see it for what it is. I'm not saying, you know, good, bad, or indifferent, but the idea that the Democrats are pacifists and Trump is a warmonger, obviously not. Like it's just so obvious
Mm-hmm.
that that's not the case. And also at the level of why Trump was elected in 2016, and I would say again in 2024, was out of anti-war sentiment. Now, might he disappoint that anti-war sentiment? Of course. But nonetheless, he himself wants to avoid war, and his voters want to avoid war. And it's a rebuke of the foreign policy establishment status quo and a rebuke of the Democrats. You know, he did, in fact, run in 2016 against the war on terror. He did. He ran to pull out of these things, Afghanistan, etc.
Well, he was telling us about all the plans he had to take out ISIS.
Yeah, sure. In order to allow the United States to withdraw, meaning that if you do the withdrawal the wrong way, then you get ISIS.
Right.
If you participate in the Syrian civil war incorrectly, you get ISIS.
Right. So this
Right?
was his
So,
plan. This was his plan to end. Said you needed to do this in order to end the war on terror.
yeah. And so that was, you know, and again, it's cognitive dissonance for, you know, leftists, especially millennials, who just associate Republicans with war and Democrats with peace. But it just ain't so,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And, you know, who are just eager to disqualify Trump, but that's just pure partisanship. That's just pure pro-democratic party sentiment and propagandizing. And, you know, again, good, bad, or indifferent. It just is not the case that this is an accurate portrayal of the way the parties are competing at the level of policy.
So
So, and again, Trump's kind of sui generis this way, and he does represent. And again, rather than thinking what's the positive alternative he's offering, like I don't know, hemispheric or continental imperialism as opposed to global imperialism, no, it's very simple. He wanted to get out of the war on terror. and he wants these wars that broke out under Biden to end. And he does not want war with China. And it's not that he wants these wars to end so that he can prepare for war with China. No, he wants to keep the peace with China, which might also mean beefing up US forces in East Asia, but not to attack. No. No matter what, the I know the realists as opposed to the neocons. Like John Mearsheimer is like, we should be focusing on China. No, that's not Trump's perspective. It's just not. He understands that Xi is an important figure on the world stage and that the US has to deal with China.
You had a line in the article about the American Revolution is I can't remember, it doesn't end, or it has no borders, or
Promise is evergreen.
promises evergreen. What does
Desires not to rule people, but only to free, not to rule, but to free peoples and places.
right? So in that context, Canada and Greenland and these other places being part of the America would be should be thought of as to be liberated. Canada's liberation.
Potentially. I mean, look, obviously that's not what the capitalists are about, or their political system or their states are about, and that's not what Trump is about. Of
But it's
course
what the
not.
revolution was about.
It certainly is what the revolution is about. So let's talk about that. So what is the United States? So we kind of got a little bit diverted there. So the United States is a mixture of things historically, meaning it is the long-term historical effects of the revolution, but it's also the long-term historical effects of now capitalism and how capitalism has undermined the revolution. But again, in ways that the left is not really prepared to deal with soberly and realistically. Meaning, there is an assumption since the 1930s, and the Trotskyists should know better, but they don't. And that's why they're not really good Trotskyists. They're not good followers of Trotsky. They give in to the Stalinist idea that progressive capitalism is better. FDR is better. The Great Society is better. I mean, that's the Stalinist perspective. It's the Popular Front perspective. It's the idea that there are progressive capitalists and reactionary capitalists. So look, the language of the RCP.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what they are now?
Yeah, I mean they did. To be fair to them, they wouldn't have. They didn't say
It's
progressive
reactionary.
capital. Yeah.
No, they said it's reactionary, which implies the status quo is progressive.
Right.
And it's like, no, that Marxists should not accept that. Meaning, what is apparently conservative in capitalism can be progressive, namely progressive capitalism. And what is progressive in capitalism could be reactionary or conservative in capitalism. Meaning, it has nothing to do with the direction of socialism. So both and neither, we could say, point in the direction of the possibility of socialism, both conservative policies and progressive policies. So the idea that, again, that we're going to get to socialism through a series of progressive capitalist reforms, no. Especially if they're not achieved under any pressure of class struggle, of the working class, when they're just technocratic. Because
Yeah,
that's
they're
what we're
trying to
talking
solve their own problems.
exactly. And that's been true since the 1930s. So it's not
Well,
true
before that.
that, yeah, and certainly before that. I mean, I would say, look, the progressivism historically did have to contend with a mass socialist working class movement
Mm-hmm.
in a way that actually was not the case in the 1930s in the United States, for example.
Mm.
It was a different kind of thing, meaning the communists operating in the unions in the 1930s really did present a different phenomenon, both socially and politically, than the old Socialist Party before World War One. Meaning, there was a reason why the Stalinists were able to achieve a political alliance with the progressive liberals in a way that was not the case at the time of Eugene Debs with the Socialist Party of America. That did not happen. It could not happen back then. It could happen in the 30s, and that's because the communists played a different role than the old socialists did. So all this stuff is fudged in the historical record, and again, that's Stalinism. But the Trotskyists go along with it.
Why did they do that?
And I think it's out of a kind of desperation and also at a kind of tailism, we could say, to use a term. But really, it's about competing for the same kind of potential recruit student leftist milieu.
Right.
Now, certainly now, that's all that it's about. Like in the 30s, you could say, okay, Trotsky had a perspective, the Fourth International had a perspective of intervening in the socialist, social democratic, and communist parties, and through splits and regroupments, trying to achieve new revolutionary leadership of a proletarian socialist revolutionary movement. But that is not what's been going on since World War II. It has not been. It's been the kind of parasitic relationship of Trotskyism to Stalinism. And under the impact of historical developments that are new and different. And so even the character of imperialism has changed because the Cold War and the era of decolonization really cast the issue of imperialism in a different light. I think in a light that's much more about liberal anti-imperialism than it is about socialist anti-imperialism.
Right.
And unfortunately, the Trotskyists have been swept along in the wake of that. The Stalinists have been in the 20th century were in the leadership of that shift. But the Trotskyists have had to follow along. And it's only left the left cons and the anarchists to sort of beg to differ, on the outmost fringes.
So yeah, one of jumping off what you're saying there, it strikes me that, like the Stalinists and even like the liberals, often, America and capitalism are thought of as the same thing.
Yeah, we could talk about that. I mean, look, I know that I have a reputation, and via platypus of being like a student of Moishe Postone, and this kind of thing. Those Moishe and I had like serious political disagreements, like extremely antagonistic relationship at the level of politics. Mm-hmm. I like Lenin. He's an anti-Leninist, like hardcore, both Trotskyists and Stalinist varieties. However, I will say that he published an article in 2006, History and Helplessness, that is instructive and is, it's very basic, and I think that it's just very fundamental. So he talked about two things. I mean, he talked about things that are hot button issues for people. He said if August Bebel of the SPD, the historic chairman of the SPD, who died right before World War I, and so it's unclear what he would have done, whether he would have sold out on August 4th in 1914 or not. He called anti-Semitism the socialism of fools. And Moishe said anti-Zionism is the anti-imperialism of fools.
Yeah, I did.
Right? Yeah. And that has not earned Moishe any friends, but it's also true. Now, he also said that in the era of high Marxism before World War I, there was a kind of fetishized anti-capitalism that was anti-British. And that what has happened is that that's become anti-Americanism in the handoff from the British to the American-led world capitalist system. So anti-Americanism is a fetishized anti-capitalism. And then we also have the idea that, Zizek talks about, but many talk about, which is that maybe only the United States and England and Canada are actually capitalists. Maybe the continental European countries were never quite capitalists and have not been capitalist. And only that capitalism is Anglo. Actually, at a platypus panel here in Chicago at Northwestern University, there was an Irish nationalist guy who spoke on a panel. And he said, the Anglos, they don't care about life, they only care about property. Yeah.
It's a white people problem.
Yeah, it is. Right. So he was talking about how, the blacks rioting and the George Floyd protests manifests were his people. As an Irishman, the blacks rioting were his people. And, they could have killed as many people as they wanted to, but really what gets the whites' attention is when you destroy their property. So there was this idea that, like, I don't know, like the English have it in their like racial nature to love property and hate life. I mean, what are we even
How
talking
very
about? But
progressive.
yeah, how very progressive. Well, I mean, he was an Irish nationalist, so there's that
Mhm.
problem. However, he was some kind of a leftist as well, and some kind of a socialist or a communist in his own mind as well. And so, I do think that when thinking about world capitalism and the struggle for socialism, anti-Americanism is a serious ideological problem that the left has to overcome.
So, okay, let's leave with this. In what sense, do you agree with the statement that I titled the stream, Why Canada Must Join the Empire of Liberty?
Yeah, join the American Revolution. Well, in the end, it will. Meaning, if socialism has any chance at all, then of course Canada will join the Empire of Liberty. So let's unpack that. So I mentioned that the United States is both bourgeois revolutionary and capitalist, and that the capitalist aspect contradicts the bourgeois revolutionary aspect. But it is both. And after all, for Marx, capitalism itself is both.
Right.
It's both bourgeois right and the contradiction of bourgeois right in industrial production.
Dialectics.
Dialectics. But also, I think, we do have a kind of vulgar Marxism that we get from Second International Marxism, but really only on the fringes of it. It's not really core to their understanding, but also from Stalinism more prominently now, which is the idea of progress in modes of production, and that identifies the industrial forces of production as progressive and the bourgeois social relations as reactionary.
Right.
And that is not the Marxist view. That is not the Marxist view, because we don't have socialist production under capitalism. It's not like you change the ownership of the factories and then that's socialism. No, that might be the dictatorship of the proletariat, but it's not socialism. It's not communism, in fact. That the Marxists look forward to a qualitative transformation of production, of social production, not just put the workers in charge of capitalist industry. Now, again, because we have the Soviet experience and the experience of communist China, we basically have these nominally people's democracies, workers' states, what have you, doing a program of industrialization in which they copy capitalist industry, and then they call that building socialism. It's not. It's not. And I know that people are going to be like, oh, state capitalism, blah, blah, blah. No, the issue is world capitalism has to be overcome. And it has to be overcome through the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that does mean the reappropriation of capitalist production, but also its transformation. And that's what we haven't seen. And that's what is really necessary. And again, understanding this in political terms, why would people ever want to overcome capitalism? It's not going to be just an economic calculation. I was just recently teaching Wilhelm Reich, Ideology as a Material Power. The vulgar Marxism. That if it's not about freedom, and if it's not about seeing capitalism as an obstacle to freedom, then it won't happen, because it's not going to be some kind of bottom line calorie counting calculation.
Right. The way I used to sell it, like maybe 5-10 years ago, I'd say, well, we have finite resources and capitalists and capital needs infinite. I'm
growth.
saying that wrong, but
no, infinite growth would be socialism.
Right.
So we only have distorted growth, and it would be qualitative growth, meaning it's not just quantitative. So infinite growth in the sense of qualitative development, not just producing more stuff. So I think that that's the other thing, is that socialist construction in the Soviet Union and China was about transforming peasants into factory workers. It's also about overcoming rural poverty. And I don't think these are models for what has to happen out of advanced capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's going to seem like, oh, you're talking about a kind of post-Marxism, or you're some kind of old-fashioned Marxist dictatorship of the proletariat. Like, it's just going to, strike people as contradictory things. it only appears so because Marxism has fallen apart into these very, you know, disparate perspectives on the current state of affairs. And, again, I think we still live in capitalism. Obviously we do in the colloquial sense, but I think in the Marxist sense. And therefore I think the task is the
You
same.
don't think it's turning
Is the
into
political
techno feudalism?
I think it's always been techno feudalism. In other words, like that's just another way of saying that capitalism is regressive with respect to bourgeois right. Right? So meaning wage slavery. What's that? Of course the capitalists have always treated the workers as serfs. Of course. Right? So again, the thing with the specter of a dystopia is that we have to understand that we're imagining it now. It's not a future telos. It's where we are. That's what we're seeing in that menace. But at the same time, again, dialectically, contradictorily, I think people don't see themselves as slaves or serfs, and we wouldn't want to convince them that that's what they are. We want to convince them that they are individuals with rights, and they have a right to organize and a need to associate and develop a politics
Oh shoot, I'm still here. Don't worry.
that's not just a largesse, a noblesse oblige of the rich people or of the bureaucratic, technocratic elite. So I think that that's the real challenge. Is that really the left thinks of itself spontaneously, unconsciously, as if they were in charge, they would do better policies.
Right.
So they resent the people who are in charge now, and that means also begging from them occasionally. And whereas really the task is for the working class to develop its own power so that it is not dependent on how the capitalists have to rearrange their deal, how they have to rearrange their rackets. Because that's what we have. That's what capitalist politics is about. That's the way it's going to be. That's the way it's always going to be, right? Until socialists take power, until the working class takes power, but really socialists, because of course the working class can become a capitalist racket too. So now I'm going to sound like a real old style Marxist and invoke Trotsky, who said that if the unions are not under revolutionary leadership, then they're just appendages of the capitalist state. Imperialism, right? So, in a way, I want to touch bases with all my erstwhile comrades, the Maoists, the Stalinists, the anarchists, the Trotskyists, the left comms. I want to say, you all have a piece of the puzzle. The problem is you have a distorted perspective that's partial and one-sided from that partial truth. And we do have to try to grasp the totality again in the way that an older Marxist vision was capable of doing. Was capable of seeing the working class as a subject of imperialism, not just an object, and
Right.
not just a bought off class collaborationist, labor lieutenants of capital, labor aristocracy,
Bourgeois
without.
proletariat. I was just watching today some
Mhm,
anarchists talk about how Engels was talking about it. Yeah, the bourgeois
mhm,
proletariat has bought off.
mhm. Sure. And, again, that's true at one level, but it's not like Engels ever said, and therefore they're the enemy. It's just being aware of what one is struggling in and against and with. The working class has a stake in capitalism. Of course it does. So the question is not, again, the revolutionary subjects of the 20th century to try to find the people who have no stakes in the cisgendered, patriarchal, capitalist, white supremacist system. But no, actually, the people who do have a stake in it all, the working class, have to transform it. That's the hard one because again, we're such pawns and so pulled by the strings of capitalist politics and the culture wars and everything else. It's just terrible. I mean, I think that that's really the issue. Again, when Trump said these things, I just thought, well, okay, so Obama or Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden wouldn't have said these things. But if they had, it would have been heard differently,
Yeah, 100%.
right? And so, what, so don't give some spurious Marxist reasons for your rad lib sentimentality that's been rubbed the wrong way.
Harsh.
It's the
But I
truth.
think that's what the left needs to hear. Um, all right, Chris. Thanks a lot.
Cool.
It was great. This is, yeah, exactly what I want to get out of the stream.